Hello, I'm Ollie, and this is Criminally, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today, I'm going to try for the second time to review one of the most difficult books I've ever read, Hogg by Samuel R Delany. So I tried to do this review at the weekend. I filmed probably about 10 minutes of me babbling about this book and then was completely unhappy with it. It's a very, very difficult book to read and a very difficult book to talk about as well, as I learned when I tried to review it the other day. So I've given it a few days to kind of digest and to ruminate on my thoughts about it. We've also had some really good discussions on my Discord server, so a number of people were reading it along with me there. And we've had some interesting chats about it there. And I've also, and this is very rare for me, I've also done something a bit like research in that I've read a few things about Delany and watched a couple of videos as well. And I felt that I have had to do that because this is such a difficult book and it contains such troubling stuff that I wanted to make sure that I talked about it appropriately and sensitively. Now, that said, this is me, this is me, and anyone who's watched my channel for any length of time will know that my style is really to talk about my reaction to a book rather than any kind of in-depth analysis. There are other channels that do that kind of in-depth thing far, far better than I ever could. Juan at the channel Played by Visions has talked about Hogg in the past, and I definitely recommend his channel if you want more informed and in-depth discussion of transgressive literature, which is what Hogg is. So it's a really difficult book, and it's a really difficult book for two reasons, I think. For three reasons. So the first one is some of the content is enormously troubling. So, trigger warning right now. I will be talking about some of that in the review. So if you want to switch off now, then feel free to. So there's that. It's also, I think, an interesting book culturally because of when it was written and who Samuel Delany was. And I think that makes it a book that I thought about more than I would have done if it had been written at a different time or Delany had been a different person. So I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute as well. And it's also a difficult book because of, and this I guess ties into the second point, but it's also a difficult book because it's difficult to understand why it exists at all. It's so extreme and so upsetting a lot of the time that it's hard to imagine why somebody would have wanted to write it, and indeed why it remains in print today. So that's something else I'll kind of touch on in the review. So I wanted to give my brain time to process the book and to think about it properly before doing this review. Partly because I didn't want to. I wanted to talk about it in a way that didn't gloss over the horrible stuff that is in this book. I wanted to make sure people were very aware of that before starting to read it, if this video indeed inspires anyone to read it. And it's certainly not a book I would necessarily recommend. And the other reason was, and as going back to the whole point of my channel, which is just to talk about my reaction to books and books I've enjoyed or found interesting, I wanted to be able to talk about it in a way that was informed, but that didn't sound pretentious. So you could be you could be the judges of whether or not I achieved that. But I want to try and talk about the book in quite a straightforward way, rather than over intellectualizing it a bit. But we'll see how I get on with that. Okay, so let's talk about what the book is. So the book is, and I think Delany would describe it as such, indeed has described it as such, a work of transgressive pornography. So let's talk very quickly about those two words. So I'll come back to transgressive. Let's talk about pornography first, because that's probably a more familiar word. So what is pornography? So the definition of pornography in an online dictionary I looked at 5 minutes before starting this video, is that it's a work that describes explicit, sexual acts, sexuality, physical things, with the intent of causing arousal. And I think that second part is quite interesting, because when you are creating something as an artist, you can't really know what the reaction of the person consuming that work of art will be. And maybe pornographers can be more sure than many people, than many artists. But it's an interesting question, or an interesting point, I think, that a piece of art, a type of art, if indeed you consider pornography art, that a type of art is defined by the reaction of the reader or viewer to it, as much as it is by the intention of the creator. So, the famous quote about pornography is, and I'm probably paraphrasing it slightly, but is, pornography is whatever gives the judge a hard on. So, in that definition, pornography is defined as something that has a particular impact on the person who is consuming it, rather than anything else, any other category or thing that we would use to define a genre or a type of art. So pornography. So is Hogg pornography? So I will talk a bit about kind of what's in it, but it's definitely pornographic in terms of its explicitness. So there is huge amounts of sexual activity in this book, and huge amounts of sexual violence, and it's all described, or is largely described, in a way that is akin to pornography, in that it's very focused on the physical side of things, and it's very descriptive. But it's a book I find it hard to imagine anybody becoming aroused by, or certainly I'm not sure I'd want to share a cup of tea with anybody who was aroused by it. So I was thinking about other books I've read recently which were similar in terms of their kind of explicitness and some of their content, and there were two that sprung to mind, both of which I've read for this same Disturbing Books project that I'm doing. So one is Cows by Matthew Stokoe. So I don't think anybody would describe Cows as pornographic, but it is a book that contains a lot of very descriptive writing about extreme sexual activity, and indeed some of the same things that are in Hogg are discussed in Cows, and similarly, but not a work that you would ever describe as pornography, I don't think. Or this one, Story of the Eye by Georges Bataille, which I massively preferred to either Cows or Hogg, which again has a lot of sexual description in it. I mean, really, it's a book all about sex and about different sexual acts. And whilst I wouldn't say that it was a book I personally found arousing, I can kind of see how some people might, and how some people would consider it to be a work of erotica. But erotica rather than pornography. And I guess that's another one of those weird definition things, isn't it? Which is, erotica is like posh pornography, isn't it, basically? It's pornography dressed up as art. Interestingly, and in all the videos where I've talked about Hogg so far, I've touched on it in wrap-ups and TBRs and things, I've flashed up a particular cover image, which is one I found online for a different edition. I think the contents of the edition are the same, but it's a different cover. The cover I've got on my Kindle version is this, which is just, it describes the book as a modern erotic classic. Whilst I think people could describe this book as pornography, I'm not sure many people would describe it as erotic. And also, this is the most misleading cover I've ever seen. There are so many things about this cover which completely have nothing to do with the book at all. So firstly, you've got this sort of sexy stocking thing going on here. There's no stocking, there are no stockings in this book. There is no lace in this book. And also you've got this kind of typeface they've used is kind of a, kind of almost Art Deco kind of 30s. So looking at this, you might imagine that it's a book set in the 30s about, like flapper girls or something like that. Nothing could be further from the truth. So I was just amused by the complete inappropriateness of this cover image. Okay, so that's the pornography part talked about to an extent. Let me talk about transgression then. And then I will talk about what's actually in the book. And I'm deliberately delaying doing that. Okay, so transgressive fiction is fiction that tries to shift the boundaries, that tries to push the envelope and tries to get us to think about different things. And Story of the Eye is definitely transgressive in that sense. Now, one of the videos I watched about Delany was like a panel he was on, and he talks about transgression in that and his intention with writing transgressive fiction. And what he talks about there is this idea that there is a line of what is acceptable in society. There's a line of what is acceptable sexual behaviour. And works of transgressive literature take you beyond that line. And what he says is, he feels that if you're trying to do transgression, what you should do is keep going beyond that line and reporting back basically on what you find there. So coming back and writing about all the terrible things you've thought about, not even necessarily terrible things, but all the unacceptable things that you've thought about, that you've encountered in either your real life or in your imagination when you've crossed over that transgressive line. And what he says is, if you keep doing that, if artists keep on doing that, keep on going over that line, and keep on creating art that talks about what's on the other side of that line, then eventually the line will move. Yeah, and people on the Discord mentioned this, and it occurred to me as well. My son, who's really into politics at the moment, talks about the Overton window a lot. And my understanding of the Overton window is kind of the window of discussion in society and opinions in society and things like that are acceptable politically and kind of safe politically. So the mainstream, effectively. And over time, the Overton window can move, one way or the other. And, arguably in both the US and the UK in the last 5 to 10 years, we've seen it move to the right in some respects. As we've had things like, Brexit and some of the dialogue around Trump when he came to power, the kind of things that started getting talked about moved the Overton window. So I think what Delany's talking about is something very simple and similar, which is, you keep on bringing this stuff up, and eventually people start to accept it a bit more, maybe, and that line of what's acceptable moves. So why is that important? So let me talk for a second about what's actually in the book. I'm finally getting to that point. Okay, so the story of the book is basically quite simple. So it's about, the narrator is a boy, a young boy who's like 12, or that's that kind of age, who immediately is thrown into sexual situations. Yeah. So it starts with him, this weird kind of sexual situation with him and another boy who lives in the same apartment building, and the boy's sister. And they're basically kind of prostituting each other out, and the father of the brother and sister gets involved as well. So there is immediately child abuse, incest, all sorts of horrific stuff going on right from the start of the book, and that sets the tone for the book. What then happens is that this young narrator gets picked up effectively by this guy called Hogg, and Hogg is the central character in the book, really. And Hogg is a disgusting, despicable character who is just completely filthy, and by that I mean physically filthy. So deliberately does not wash and things like that. And I was reminded also of some of the characters in 120 Days of Sodom by the Marquis de Sade, which I talked about recently. So there's a load of stuff in there about like personal hygiene and lack thereof. So Hogg is like that, and Hogg revels in his own disgustingness, and to the extent that he reminded me a lot of the character Mr. Twit from the Roald Dahl book The Twits, who is like deliberately disgusting and has stuff, has week old food, mouldering in his beard and things like that. Hogg is very much like that, but he's a version of Mr. Twit who is aggressively and appallingly sexual as well. So the way Hogg makes his living is basically by raping women for money. So wealthy men who want to get, revenge or, to punish particular women in their lives, hire Hogg and this gang he has of guys to sexually assault the women. Okay? And you see that, very explicitly. So, right from the start, there is, as I've said, there's child abuse, there's incest, there's all sorts of, other sexual activity, including, and I forget the proper name for it now, but people eating shit. So there's that, and there's very descriptive scenes of extreme sexual violence and just physical violence against women as well. So it's really shocking stuff. It's really difficult to read, and Delany somehow manages, certainly for the first half of the book, to keep ramping things up. So as I said, it starts with this incredibly disturbing scene involving all kinds of horrible stuff, and yet he somehow manages to up the ante chapter and throw in something new that kind of seems somehow even more appalling. So it's difficult. Yeah, it's a really difficult book to read, and a difficult book because of all that content, and because of the fact that it almost sells itself as, well, it doesn't sell itself as pornography, but because of the fact it could be described as pornography and sometimes feels like pornography in terms of the way it's written. Because of all those things, it's a really difficult book to justify and to defend as well. Which brings me to Delany. Oh, and I should say as well, actually, so as I've said, a bunch of people read this book alongside me, with me, on my Discord, and we discussed it. A lot of those people DNF'd it. A lot of those people, even people who have read, a lot of disturbing books in the past and were, what I would call quite hardened readers in terms of, disturbing content, just couldn't. Not so much they couldn't handle it, but that they didn't want to handle it. It was like, you know right from the start what this book is going to be like, because it hits you in the face with it immediately, and then it just doesn't let up. And it's like, a lot of people saying, why would I put myself through this? I don't see the purpose of it. I don't see the point of it. And I totally get that. Okay, so let's talk very briefly about Samuel Delany then, and then I will get to my kind of final summings up, because I think thinking about Delany as an individual is quite important. So Samuel Delany is an African American guy who's also gay, and who was born in, I think, probably like the 40s. So he grew up in a society where being black was probably not a great thing to be in many ways. Huge barriers put up against black people progressing. Terrible racism in many parts of America. Right, I was going to say right up until the civil rights movement. Clearly, right up until the present day. But he was born and came of age before the civil rights movement was really happening and was starting to make a difference. So there's that, and he's also gay. So clearly, also the 50s and 60s were not a good time to be a gay man in America either. So do either of those things justify Hogg? And I think, to an extent, they do. Because as appalling as it is, I think if we go back to thinking about Delany's description of the purpose of transgressive fiction, then the purpose of transgressive fiction is to move that line. And some of the things he talks about in Hogg are not the appalling things I've talked about, but they are explicitly sexual. There's a lot of explicit, gay sex in the book as well. That is, gay sex between consenting adults. So as well as all the horrible stuff, there is gay sex between consenting adults, which I think, nowadays we would consider to be fine, to be normal, to be absolutely acceptable. But clearly, when he wrote the book, and the book came out in 1969, I think, and when he was, growing up and, coming of age and being a young man, it was not acceptable in any way in America. It was, it was criminalised, and in the UK as well. It was criminalised. It was frowned upon. terrible discrimination and acts of violence against gay people. And so part of me wonders if that is, to an extent, the purpose of Hogg, is to talk about all these different things, to take you so far over that line of transgression that the line moves a bit. And the bit that it moves is the bit that says, actually, sex between consenting adults who happen to both be men is absolutely fine. Get over it. And I do wonder if that is, part of his purpose in this, as well as reflecting on, things he had experienced in his own life. I don't know if he experienced sexual abuse as a child, but that certainly is a central theme of this book. So perhaps he did, and perhaps he was reflecting on that as well. So I think if there is a justification for this book, and it is a horrible book, a very difficult book, not a book I would recommend people reading. If there is a justification, I think it's that. I think it's that its intent is to move that line just a little bit, just enough to make society more accepting of things that they should be accepting of, while still denouncing things that should be denounced. I said I was going to try and not sound pretentious, didn't I? I'm not sure if I achieved that. So it's an interesting book, and that whole question of why is really interesting. And the other thing that's interesting is, so Samuel Delany, he didn't just write Hogg. He wrote loads of books. He's a very, very well-respected author of science fiction. He's won awards. He's, in a way, kind of quite a mainstream author. So the fact that he wrote a book as extreme as this, and indeed he wrote other books in a similar vein to Hogg. Most of his work was science fiction, but he did write other books like Hogg. The fact that he wrote a book as extreme as this, I think, says to me at least that he really felt like he had something to say. He really had to get this stuff out. He felt it was important. This could have been a career-killing book. It is so extreme. But his science fiction is still respected. He's still very respected in that field. So I think clearly he, as I say, he really felt he needed to write this book. And I think that in itself is interesting and made me pay attention to the book in a way that I wouldn't have done, or indeed didn't do, with something like 120 Days of Sodom, where it did feel to me like, that was, it felt to me like 120 Days of Sodom was a work of pornography. It was a work that was designed to arouse both Dissard and people he might have shared it with at the time. And it felt to me, and a number of people have disagreed with me on this point in the comments on my video on that, but it felt to me like that was the only point of that book, and it has no value other than that. It's an interesting book because it's so old and because it's persisted and because of its history, but I don't think it has value as a work of literature. Whereas Hogg, for all the appalling things about it, I think probably does have some value as a work of literature. Which isn't to say you should read it, because you probably shouldn't. Okay, time for a random book from the shelf. So, this is a book I have talked about on the channel before. I did a review of it, but it was ages ago when I had like a few hundred subscribers. So I thought I'd pull it off the shelves again and talk about it, because I think it's fantastic. So it's Throat Sprockets by Tim Lucas, which is a very strange, surreal, dreamlike vampire novel about this guy who discovers this weird film in like a rundown cinema and becomes obsessed with it. And it's about him trying to find out about the creation of the film. And there's something about that kind of cursed art kind of trope that I really love. I always love stories. Well, not always. I usually love stories that include it. And this, I think, is a really good example of it. So I hope you found that interesting. If you made it this far, well done. I'm quite pleased with myself for having made it this far. Having failed at making this video once before, I think I'm definitely going to have a cup of tea once I finish filming, and I think you should too. But yes, let me know if you've read Hogg. Let me know what you thought of it. Let me know what you thought of my review, because I'm still not entirely sure my thoughts are settled on this book yet. But those are my thoughts today. So yes, let me know what you think. And as always, thank you very much for watching. Hope you're safe and well out there. Hope you're reading good stuff. and I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.